Okay, welcome everyone to this new session of the virtual Kant Congress. I'm very pleased to see everyone and to introduce this session, which is hosted by the Society of Kant Studies in Spanish. And we will have 3 talks, and the whole session will be hosted by Iliana Beade, of the let me check, the National University of Rosario.
That's correct.
Sorry about it. So before I hand over, I wanted to mention that it would be nice if those who are here can switch on their cameras if they can. Hello, Yannis. And I also wanted to mention that we normally keep open the Zoom meeting after the formal part. So after the recording has stopped, everyone is very welcome to hang on so that they can ask further questions or have a chat. So I now hand over to Iliana.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for being here, and my special thanks to Professor Luis Felipe Garcia and his assessors for organizing this virtual Congress, which allows us to celebrate the anniversary of Kant's birth. My name is Ileana, and I am the president of the SECLE, la Sociedad de Estudios Kantianos en Lengua Española. On behalf of this association, I welcome you to this new session of the virtual Kant Congress with a cosmopolitan purpose. I am proud to introduce 3 young researchers who have recently won an award granted by our association, the Kant Young Spanish Language Researchers Award, in its 4th edition. Es el Premio Kant para Jóvenes Investigadores e Investigadoras en Lengua Española, 4ª edición. This award calls for the submission of unpublished articles which are evaluated according to their originality, the soundness and coherence of the argumentation, and of course, the knowledge of Kant's philosophical work. I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers. In first place, Gustavo Cruz holds a professor degree from the La Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Buenos Aires, and is a doctoral candidate at that university. The title of his lecture is The Discursive Basis of Concept and its Necessary Modalization in Kant's Philosophy. Then we will have the presentation of Marilu Martinez Fischer. She has obtained the first mention of our Kant Award. Marilu holds a PhD in philosophy from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico and Fernuniversität in Germany. She develops her research at the university, la Universidad Panamericana, and the title of her lecture is The Categorical Imperative and the Doctrine of Law, a necessary but indirect relationship. Finally, Marcos González García from Spain. He has obtained the second mention of the award. Marcos has recently started his doctoral research at the faculty, en la Facultad de Filosofía de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and has obtained a pre-doctoral contract in the Department of Logic and Theoretical Philosophy in that university. And the title of his lecture is The Role of Judgment in the Kantian Understanding of Law. Each of the presenters will have around 20 minutes to make their presentation. And after listening to the 3 lectures, we will have time for questions, comments, observations, and so on. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for their presence, and we can now listen to the speakers. Thanks.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I will share presentation. There we are. Before I start, I wanted to thank the Virtual Kant Congress for providing the space for all researchers of Kant's philosophy to meet and share our works. I also want to thank Iliana Beade and the Society of Kant Studies in Spanish, not only for inviting me today, but also for rewarding my work. The paper I wrote for the award was, one sec, please, was titled The Discursive Basis of Concepts and Its Necessary Modalization in Kant's Philosophy. In it, I focused on one specific point about Kant's theory of modality, theory that in the past few decades has had a revival. For example, some academics state that the topic of modality is essential for understanding Kant's philosophy in its whole meaning, and they also state that the problem of the nature of modal judgments can be found in the genesis of his philosophy. The originality introduced by Kant in his theory of modality can be traced throughout the first critique, and it intertwines with one of the core topics of the text. That is the objective value of the a priori concepts of understanding. That is so because without the modal progression, which starts with the mere possibility, passes to actuality, and ends in necessity, concepts could not be considered as knowledge. My research in particular starts in paragraph 76 of the critique of the power of judgment, where we found that in Kant's view, the concept of contingency has its roots only in human understanding. This is due to the discursive nature of our understanding in comparison with a hypothetic intuitive understanding whose comprehension of the whole prior to the comprehension of the parts suppresses the distinction of the contingent and the real. Upon this problematic, I asked myself why the discursive understanding must think its concepts within a determinate modality. The following is a summary of my paper. We can say that there are two major interpretations of modality. One that reduces the ground of modal judgments to a psychological and subjective attitude, and another one that considers modality only in relation to syllogism. I think that both of them might be hiding the philosophical implication of a modality that is at its core in close connection to the nature of the discursive nature of human understanding. This connection can be found in Kant's notion, according to which modal judgments create a link between what is thought in the judgment and the faculties of knowledge. I believe that this point has great implication for modal categories. I believe that this point has great importance in the antinomy of the power of judgment in the third critique, where this implication of modal categories becomes crucial for the resolution of said antinomy. In this antinomy, the reflecting judgment faces the problem of the synthesis of contingent forms of nature within a rational system, as a result of the act of reflection on organized beings. This antinomic dispute derives from a judgment that takes a phenomenon as a result of the mechanism of nature and, at the same time, as a product of the technique that is a teleologically organized being. Here Kant says that the possible refers to the thing as put in the concept as a product of thought, while the actual refers to the pointing of the thing as existent. Thus, the distinction between the possible and the actual lies in the relation of the concept to the faculties of knowledge, either with understanding as a possible being or with perception as an actual given being. According to this, Kant proposes to resolve the antinomy in question by assigning contingency to the human understanding itself, instead of referring it to the materiality of natural beings. In this way, contingency is a mark of human understanding. I'm sorry. In this way, contingency is a mark of human understanding, which proceeds from the parts to the whole, that is, in a discursive manner. Human understanding strives toward unity from the multiplicity of data through successive judgments and produces concepts along the way. At this point, an interesting identity comes clear. The discursive understanding, which proceeds by producing concepts of things, is what we can call, strictly speaking, thought. This means that thought is necessarily discursive, because, as Kant says in one of his reflections, knowledge through concepts is thought. Hence, discursivity proceeds by thinking and is marked by the modalization of concepts. Following this reasoning, if our understanding were to be intuitive, there will be neither sensitive intuitions, which are the actual data without knowledge, nor will there be concepts, in which the object is thought only in its possibility, as Kant says in the third critique. Therefore, this consideration, according to which the possibility is taken as a specific feature of concepts and the topic of discursivity, bring us to the question about the form or the way in which our finite and discursive understanding produces concepts. In the logic, Kant presents the theory of logical actions of understanding, which can be reduced to three: comparison, reflection, and abstraction. The result of such process of three moments is the action of the determination of a mark to a concept through a judgment. In this way, every concept finds itself in a state of greater or smaller determination or abstraction. However, the most abstracted concept is an empty concept, and the completely specified or determinate concept can never be given in actual knowledge, because the thorough determination is thinkable but not available through the finite series of actions of our understanding. This process presents the principle of determinability of concepts, which says that every concept is indeterminate according to everything that is not yet included in it. What we can take from this principle, in order to further understand the modalization of concepts, is that according to that principle, we always we always conceive every concept as open to an ongoing possible determination. The concept is determined in a progressive way by an understanding that alludes in each case one of two contradictory predicates to the concept of a possible predicate. This means that these predicates do not derive from what is already being thought inside the concept according to the principle of no contradiction. However, this principle of determinability refers only to the formality of concepts and the way in which determinate judgments proceeds. Instead, Kant explained that when we also consider the materiality of the concept and the possibility that is being thought in it, we must follow another principle. This will be the transcendental principle of thoroughgoing or complete determination, in which not only the form of the the form of the determinate action is being considered, but also the complete content of the thing is being thought a priori. So this thing is thought under the heuristic principle of complete determination, where it's posited in a comparative relation to the totality of possible predication. Hence, it's posited in relation to the totality of reality, which is presupposed a priori as the transcendental ground of that particular thing. I refer to that principle as a heuristic one, because it does not set the actual complete determination of the thing, but instead, as a principle of rational thinking, it supposes said thing as if it were completely determinate, so that the principle can guide the determinative and gradual actions of understanding. We can see that the possibility is thought as a constituent feature of the concept even before the moment in which any determination is actually made in it. This is because every function of synthesis made in the concept is already thought a priori in relation to the complete possibility of the thing subsumed by that concept. Therefore, the discursive thought is a successions of judgments that constitute and determine concepts, and hence it necessarily marks concept with a certain modality, which results in that every concept observes its object from the point of view of its possibility. In conclusion, I want to point out that the concept of possibility found in those passages not only seems to be a logical and syllogistical concept, but it also seems to comprehend the comparative action that is a determinate positing of the thing in relation to a ground that the reason presupposes a priori. Therefore, we can say that the action of positing the thing in relation to a totality of possibility as ground of that thing alludes to a subjective principle of discursive thinking and not to an objective and actual ground. Hence, we can say that we can say as well that this subjective supposition is the result of an action of reflection, where the particular thing that is being thought is taken as a product of thinking. Upon this, we can reinforce the notion of modality as a connection of the faculties of knowledge. It shows the critical originality of that notion. Modality, or the possibility, can be thought in the concept only because the latter is the discursive product of determinative actions. That is another way to say that modality belongs only to the discursive understanding. If we make a hypothesis of modality and we think it as a mode of existence of things, then we also have to take the consequences of the principle of complete determination as if they were objective. And from this point onward, it will become necessary to talk about the actual existence of an ens realissimum as ground of every particular being. Therefore, to wrap up, we can say that at the root of model judgments, there is an action of reflection, because the reflection is, and I quote, the consciousness of the relation of given representation to our various sources of cognition, end of quote. This action of reflection relates the concept and the thing thought under it to the faculties that produces an action that makes conscious the discursive ground of the concept. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Gustavo, for your presentation. And now we are listening to Mario.
Thank you very much for being here, to the organizers, and especially to Elena Beade, president of SECLE, for all the support that I had received from her. So I'm a little bit nervous about my English, but I promise I will do my best. So I will share my paper and I will read it to you. But just let me share this. Okay. Let me wait a minute. This and here, perfect. So I will start. The relationship between the categorical imperative and right, a necessary but indirect relationship. First of all, as already almost everyone knows, we have a problem with the translation of das Recht in English. So I translate the German term das Recht into English as right, following the translation of the Metaphysics of Morals, edited by Cambridge University Press and translated by Mary Gregor, okay? When entering the Kantian philosophy of right, one can find different systematic foundations that at first glance could give the impression of being pieces that do not end up relating to each other. The philosopher from Königsberg is not among the most important representatives of just naturalism, nor does he ascribe himself without further consideration to the contract school of his time. However, there are references to both the doctrine of natural law and contract theory. None of these doctrinal pieces operates in isolation without being articulated from a systematic vision that includes the principles of legitimacy as well as the execution of law. This is partly so because right, for Kant, not only requires legitimacy, but also assume as condition the assumption for power as factum. The normative of right is configured insofar as it is distinguished from ethics, but also by contrasting it with the motives of natural law and with the notion of social contract. Kant is neither a unilateralist nor a contractualist, but neither is he a positivist. Rather, he incorporates these possible approaches in his proposal for the philosophy of right insofar as they serve to respond to the condition of a juridical legislation. Therefore, his proposal is not reduced to any of these doctrines, but rather suppose a way of exposing their limits and functions. Reflecting of the normativity of right in Kant connect us with the ancient discussion of the relationship between ethics and law. Among the commentators of Kantian philosophy, the discussion revolves around the supporters of the thesis of independence, Abhängigkeitsthese in German, such as Ebbinghaus, Villachet, Geismann, Wood, and those who defend the thesis of dependence, Abhängigkeitsthese, Kersting, Brandt, Ludwig, and Höfe. The different positions discuss what extent there is or is not a link between Kantian moral philosophy and his doctrine of right. For reasons of time, we will focus on the discussion of whether or not it is possible to derive law rights for morality and the type of connection that exists between the category imperative and doctrine of right. I will propose that the relationship between the category imperative and right must be possessed as a necessary but indirect relationship, and that, therefore, rather than possessing the relationship from a derivation or application of morality to right, it is a transition, Übergang, of practical rationality from the coordinates of an exercise of mediation between the rational as well as empirical elements that the Kantian doctrine of right presuppose. I will present 4 of the main objections to the deriving right from imperative categorical and respond to them by presenting my own position. The first 3 I take up from Christian Horn, and the 4th is in the context of a discussion between Paul Gouyer and, on the other, Alan Wood and Marcus Villachek. For the answers to the objections, I will follow 2 Mexican philosophers, Dulce Maria Granja and Fabiola Rivera. I will start with the objection, and then I will respond to each one. First one, objection of congruence. Not all the doctrine of right is compatible with the categorical imperative. If right were a derivation of the categorical imperative, we will say if the right passes the test, it is as it should be, and if not, the right is morally defective and must be changed. The problem is that in the norms of positive law, Kant introduce different principles that are not compatible with the categorical imperative. We find at least some controversial cases in which this does not seem to be a true application of the categorical imperative. For example, the distinction between active and passive citizens, in which the former will have more rights than the other, the death penalty, the law of talion as a priori principle of criminal law, the non-right of resistance, and the controversial maternal infanticide for the birth for a child out of wedlock. So we'll start with the response of this first objection. First, it is not the categorical imperative, but the universal principle of right, I will refer to this UPR, that is the criterion of the determining what legitimate right should be, analogous to the way the supreme principle of virtue does with the duties of virtue in the Tugendlehre. The universal principle of right and the universal law of right are aimed at answering a more concrete question: how to regulate the exercise of freedom of rational and finite beings in the world. In this way, one notice the necessary connection, but not that the universal principle of right, UPR, and its law are equivalent to categorical imperative. The universal principle of right regulates external free will between persons in an external legislation without contradicting the proper exercise of practical external freedom, but rather making it possible. The way is precisely the clause that it is concordant with universal laws. This can be interpreted as a test formula that yields a rational normative criterion. In this sense, it functions as the connecting piece between the categorical imperative and right. It is not a necessary connection in the sense that the right that does not pass the test with respect to the universal law of right will not be right, and therefore we will not have to obey it, because if it were so, the a priori rational element will be sufficient to create a new right, and the specificity of the Kantian doctrine of right would dissolve. The path to the improvement of law requires reforms. The discussion of what is just is necessary, but not sufficient. The universal principle law and are principle of the Kantian system that allows reforms even against Kant's own prejudice. Second objection, scope objection, the limitation of the universal law of right. The universal rule of law has limited scope, can't understand right as nothing more than the regulate compatibility of the freedom of choice of all agents, and does not have a very broad scope. By this, he does not mean all human beings, as with the categorical imperative, but merely the members of the legal community and the citizens of the state. Furthermore, Kant distinguish between active and passive citizens, so that although the attributes of freedom and equality apply to all, the degree of political participation and thus of certain rights, such as the right to vote, pertain exclusively to active men and citizens who possess civil independence. In this sense, the effective application of the universal law of right will differentiate between the rights of men, women, and civil servants, which is not the case with the categorical imperative. I will respond to this. This is the response of the second objection. The ideality of normativity of right arises from the pure reason. All thought is normative scope is directed to a community of persons in continuous and irremediable interaction. The peculiarity of the doctrine of right is that it is normative, is directed to the context of a community of persons. Therefore, with respect to objections 2, we will agree in saying that the universal law of right does have a limited scope, or if you prefer, more concrete, insofar as it seeks to regulate the coexistence of free will in a community of persons. What we do not agree with objection 2 is that the doctrine of right is only addressed strictly to the members of the particular juridical community and to the active citizens of the state, males with economic independence. Kant warns of the need to think the doctrine of right from the coordinates of a cosmopolitan right, with a view to achieving the final end of the Rex Lere, that is, peace. Now, peace as the ultimate goal of the doctrine of right is irreducible to juridical legislation. All thought is a duty to approach it. However, this does not mean that it cannot be translated into regulation between states, as well as legal and political provision that must be implemented in order to achieve peace. The core of towards perpetual peace is structured as a draft peace treaty. To close the scope of the doctrine of right to only the members of a juridical community and the citizens of the state will be to suppress the international and cosmopolitan plane of the Kantian understanding of law and politics. In short, it will be to render meaningless or purposeless the project that presupposes such important words as towards peace and theory and practice. So much for this objection. Objection 3. Objection type of motivational incentive. The categorical imperative has its decisive point in the moral motivation. Then it cannot correspond to it any importance in the counter formulation of a juridical political order. For law is limited to regulating external relations between individuals and their spheres of freedom. The moral aspect of motivation is completely neglected. Legal norms cannot be constructed directly from the categorical imperative. If this were possible, either the motivation aspect would have to be separate from its central moment from the legal system, would have to be moralized. Both alternatives are certainly unacceptable for Kant. Purely moral contents play no role within state and legal order. The asymmetry is radical between legal duties and duties of virtue. Now, the answer to this objection. While juridical legislation can only demand external conformity to law, the nuance with respect to objection 3 will be to say that the form this is does not follow that the category imperative and moral theory has not concrete formulation in a juridical political order. This, at least for 2 reasons. The first, as the textual evidence shows, Kant resorts in the doctrine of right to the categorical imperative in their argumentation of the theoretical principle of freedom of mine and yours, the concept of acquisition by contract and why fulfill the promise that arise from it, the conception of a state of maximum concordance between the constitution and the legal principles, the exit from the state of nature, and even warns the criminal law is a categorical imperative. In the metaphysics of morals, and especially in the passages of the doctrine of right, in which Kant includes the reference to the categorical imperative, this not refer exclusively to properly ethical maxims or to the need of a moral motivation, but rather to the rational command that must be obeyed regardless for whether or not it entails a properly moral motivation of the agent. This form of recourse to the categorical imperative, sometimes moral imperative, refers rather to the unconditional obligation for an action insofar as it is independent of empirical conditions. Secondly, the fact that the legal legislation is limited to regulating external relations between individuals and spheres of freedom by means of external coercion does not imply that the moral aspect of motivation does not have its respective functions in the doctrine of right as a whole. As we have already noted, the final end in Zweck of the doctrine of right is a universal and lasting stipulation of peace. Kant has left the responsibility to the legislature for the enactment of laws that contributed to the attainment of peace. This regulative ideal should guide its action both with respect to the people it represents and to relation with other states understood as moral persons. In this sense, the proposal of the philosophy of right does have ethical maxims for the drafting of better laws. They are addressed especially to legislators and politicians. In addition, he warns from criteria that allude to justice, the principle of publicity of laws. All actions relating to rights of others whose maxims cannot be made public are unjust. This principle is ethical and juridical because it affects the right of humans and has justice as a starting point. Although this principle is not explicit in the doctrine of right, outlining in the metaphysics of morals, it is a central part of Kant's philosophy of right. The attainment of peace for Kant does not only refer to the state conceiving isolation, but requires alluding to the relationship with other states that form these coordinates will be considered as moral persons insofar as they are also subject of imputation. Therefore, there is an analogy between the state and the person, and therefore relations in interstate law can also be considered from the moral point of view. From this consideration, three maxims of interstate law are endowed with moral significance in the context of discourse set forth in Towards Purposed Peace. A, non-intervention in the internal affairs of states. If the state can be considered as moral person, it must be respected in its autonomy. B, the critique of colonialism. And C, the rejection of a supreme world authority. And the last objection. The authorization for coercion is analytically linked to the concept of right and not to moral theory. The discussion focused especially on the dialogue that has taken place between, on the one hand, Paul Gouguier, and the other hand, Alan Wood and Marcus Villachek. The main argument against the traditional interpretation, according to Villachek, concerns the authorization to use coercion, which, according to Kant, is analytically linked to the concept of right. According to the traditional interpretation, this authorization will have to be moral, based ultimately on the categorical imperative. But in fact, it is impossible to derive such authorization from the categorical imperative. For Villachek, the authorization to use coercion is independent of a moral argument. The legitimacy of coercion can be derived neither from the absolute value of moral autonomy, Paul Gougier's thesis, nor from the end itself formula of the categorical imperative, nor from the universal law formula of the categorical imperative. So I will start answering the fourth objection. The power to coerce is linked to the concept of right from the premise of not hindering freedom, but securing it. In such a way that coercion is an obstacle not to hinder freedom. The argument can be read from the premises of double negation and the principle of not contradiction. I will quote Kant. Resistance can counteract the hindering of an effect, promotes this effect, and is consistent with it. Now, whatever is wrong is a hindrance to freedom in accordance with the universal laws. But coercion is a hindrance of resistance to freedom. Therefore, if a certain use of freedom is itself a hindrance to freedom in accordance with the universal law, wrong. Coercion that is opposed to this as a hindrance to freedom is consistent with freedom in accordance with the universal law. That is, it is right. Hence, there is connected with right by the principle of contradiction and authorization to coerce someone who infringes upon it. Close this quote. Therefore, Kant warns that one of the essential characteristics of the supreme right principle, as opposed to the supreme principle of virtue, is precisely that it is an analytical proposition that only requires the concept of freedom to understand it. The notion of analyticity is used to indicate that the a prioristic principle of right follows immediately from the principle of freedom. Again, I will quote Kant. It is clear, in accordance with the principle of contradiction, that if external constraint checks the hindering of outer freedom in accordance with universal law, and it's thus a hindering of the hindrance of freedom, it can coexist with ends as such. I need not go beyond the concept of freedom to see this, the end that each has made by whatever his will. The supreme principle of right is therefore an analytic proposition. End of the quote. External coercion works to give me a right that is also a duty. The key idea here is that it's an obstacle not to hinder my freedom. The analytical character of juridical principles does not make their deduction from the corresponding principle of morality superfluous, since that the latter must provide the due justification, the moral power to obligate. It is not a question of justifying any external coercion, but that which makes possible the principle of coexistence of freedoms. The principle of right flow directly from the fundamental moral requirement that we use our freedom only in a universally acceptable way. The emphasis on the objection that coercion seems to distance the universal principle of right from the categorical imperative fails to distinguish that the coercion is is external legal and is aimed at preventing the obstruction of the use of external freedom in the world, and in this sense, it's also moral. Conclusions. Our proposed interpretation assumes that indeed right is not a mere derivation of the categorical imperative, nor the doctrine of right as a simple application of its moral theory, but this does not exclude a necessary but indirect relation. To explain this, it is required to answer in what sense necessary and how, if it's necessary, it is not direct. The connection is necessary as a preliminary concept of the metaphysics of morals. Kant includes a section entitled For Begriffe zur Metaphysik der Sitten, in which the concept common to the two parts of the metaphysics of morals are set out. There, Kant warns that the concept of obligation is, I quote Kant, the necessity of a free action under a categorical imperative of reason. The categorical imperative and the concept of duty are immersed as starting points in the project of the metaphysics of morals, as a system of duties. In this, we follow the traditional reading. In Kantian systematics, morality, understood as the doctrine of morals, is divided in two parts, right and ethics. Both are related to the categorical imperative as a common source of moral obligatoriness. The doctrine of virtue calls for a moral obedience to law, although the latter cannot and should not force ethical obedience to law. The categorical imperative gives a categorical character to the obedience of the law and therefore converts it into an obligation. If legal commands were hypothetical imperatives, then they will apply only to those who actually pursue the end for which the imperative prescribes a necessary means. The obligatory nature of the law does not derive from anthropology, nor from the concept of happiness, nor in the result of a theory of the social contract that makes the notion of state the guarantor of my life or happiness. The connection is necessary because the moral imperative is a proposition that commands to the duty to obey the law, and from this, the power to be in others, that is the concept of right. The relation of the command to obey the law and the categorical imperative refers in the first place to the concept of duty to obey what the law dictates, and this does imply that the observance of the law is a moral imperative. I must obey the law without any exception for the benefit of my inclination, because to obey for the benefit of my inclination cannot be susceptible of becoming universal law, because it will destroy the possibility of the law itself. The obligatory nature of the unconditional law arises from a practical reason which, through the moral imperative, dictates the necessity of obeying it. With this thesis, Kant makes obedience to law an unconditional duty that arises from a categorical command. However, this relationship is, as explained above, indirect for the following reasons. First, because it's the universal principle of right and its universal law of right that regulates what should be a legitimate right and not directly the imperative categorical. Second, the universal law of right is a postulate. The third, because there are legal duties that cannot be incorporated into the ethical legislation as indirect duties, indirect ethische Pflichten, that are added to those others that in their origin respond in a direct way to the ethical legislation itself, and that in attention to such difference Kant calls the direct ethical duties. Finally, because what is rightfully, in German is rechtens, it is not reduced to its rational principles, as will be the imperative categorical or the universal principle of right, which give legitimacy, but includes the need for empirical conditions that give it facticity. The metaphysical principle of right also function as a regulative and evaluative criteria, that is, they present a normative function to make external frameworks more compatible. However, due to the very characteristic of law, the normative guidelines that emerge from them will, by effective real, until they are promulgated in a specific empirical context by the juridical way, I mean legislative power. So we can say that what is right as a juridical statement is the result of a correct synthesis of a priori and empirical elements. Eliminating the necessity of the former, it will be an empirical right, but blind, on the criterion of what is just, and subtracting the empirical elements, it will be an a priori right, empty of reality, and therefore of applicability. Analogous to the adage of the first critique, thoughts without contents are empty, intuition without concepts are blind. Therefore, there is unnecessary to make concepts sensible, and so make intuition intelligible. So too, in the doctrine of right, the way to make rights effective in the words requires a juridical state and is representative juridical legislation. Kant on this point is not naive. So in a certain sense, what is law is a fact expressed in the laws of a particular context, is neither a pure moral normativity, not only a priori principles. That is why we insist that by the very nature of doctrine of right cannot and must not be a mere derivation of the categorical imperative. And I will finish now because I don't want to take more time.
Okay, thank you a lot, Marilu, for your excellent work. And now we can listen to our third speaker, Marcos. Thanks, Marcos, for being here. Marcos,
Hello?
we are not listening to you.
Can you
No.
see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, hello everyone. I'd like to start by showing my gratitude to Liliana Beade and the Segler for letting me present here my work, to the organizers of the Congress, and to everyone else for attending. I'll be speaking about the role of judgment in the Kantian understanding of law. The main contention of my work relates to a little studied aspect of Kant's philosophy of law, namely the factual aspect of law, which involves the necessary application of the positive juridical laws in order to decide about what must be done in particular cases. That task concerns the judges, and as Kant marks in the introduction of the doctrine of right, requires jurisprudentia, some kind of legal expertise that allows the judge to decide whether something is right or not, according exclusively to the existing positive laws. Nonetheless, the role of the judges doesn't appear as the main topic of any of Kant's writings, and that explains why this topic hasn't received as much attention from the Kantian scholars. But the lack of a systematic approach in Kant's writings shouldn't be understood as a proof that the topic has no particular relevance in Kant's philosophy, but rather as a challenge to reconstruct Kant's content on the matter from the dispersed materials that can be found. To this end, I think that we can take as a unifying thread the Wolfgang Wieland's notion of practical science. According to Wieland, every science tries to elaborate systematically its content in the form of certain propositions whose main characteristic is generality. The main task of theoretical sciences is to develop that general description of a certain region of the world. So getting out of the space of the general propositions remains for theoretical sciences always just as a possibility. But far from it, the inner sphere of practical sciences forces us to carry out this double movement. On the one hand, the practical sciences must start by developing these general propositions about its own field, exactly the same as theoretical sciences do. But on the other hand, these practical sciences must, no matter what, move from the space of generality to the space of particularity. That's to say, the practical sciences only reach their goal when they employ those general propositions to guide the human action. And that's basically what judges do with law. But the point here is that that movement from the space of the general to the space of the particular cases involves a special difficulty that Wieland named application sapori, and that emerges from the radical difference that exists between these two elements. We can describe this complexity by saying that on the one hand, every particular situation has an infinite number of individual characteristics that distinguish that particular situation from any other possible situation. And on the other hand, the general propositions must be always conceived to guide the action in a potentially infinite number of similar situations. And at the same time, those general propositions can never be specifically conceived to suit any of those particular situations. And the main content of Wieland is precisely that this application sapori can't be overcome in any possible way. Any rational actor that in any context tries to guide its action by employing general rules from any practical science, law, or medicine must face this abyss that separates the particularity of the situation and the generality of the rules. This implies that any rational praxis demands the exercise of some kind of faculty that can fill the gap in between the rules and particular cases. And Wieland himself finds this kind of faculty both in the Aristotelian phronesis and in the Kantian Urteilskraft. But as I said earlier, the main point of my work focuses on Kant's reflection on law and about the role that judgment plays in those reflections. And my main content is that in his approach to that particular area of the practical use of reason, Kant agrees with Wieland's thesis. I consider that we can trace in Kant's philosophy not only a general concern about the problem of how it is possible to connect the particular and the general, but also, at least in an implicit way, a concern about the way in which that problem arises in the jurisdictional space, in the work of judges. And as we don't have much time, I will try to show schematically what I think that are Kant's theses. The first thesis is that for Kant, law is a practical science. Although Kant hasn't elaborated a general concept of a practical science, we can say that his description of law fits perfectly Wieland's concept of a practical science. It is clear to Kant that law has to do something with positive juridical rules, general rules, that are passed by lawmakers. But as he asserts in the preface of the Metaphysical First Principles of the Doctrine of Right, he was also aware that those rules must lead always to their application to cases that come up in experience. This problem wasn't developed in that work, but I hold that we can still find in other Kantian texts some reflections on the topic of the application of laws to particular cases. That leads us to the second thesis, which is that the application of rules to particular cases implies the work of a mediating faculty. In the introduction of his short essay, commonly called Theory and Praxis, we can find a general expression of what we have called the problem of application. Kant starts there by differentiating theory and practice as two different ways of taking the principles into account. While theory relates to a set of rules insofar as they are conceived as principles of a certain generality and abstracted from the multitude of conditions which necessarily influence their application, practice is a special kind of activity that identifies with the application of those rules or with the kind of activity that has to do with the accomplishment of an end, which is thought to follow certain generally conceived principles of procedure. And then Kant adds an explicit acceptance of what we call the problem of application and points out the main role of the judgment. I quote Kant. However complete the theory may be, it's obvious that between the theory and practice, there must be a link, a connection and transition from one to the other. To the intellectual concept that contains the rule, an act of judgment must be added whereby the practitioner distinguishes whether or not something is an instance of the rule. These lines are essential because they show that Kant realized that application of rules involves a structural difficulty that has to do with a gap that separates theory and practice and that can be filled by theory itself, however complete that theory may be. And that can only happen if, as we said with Kant, there is some kind of ontological abyss that separates rules and situation. And then we have the third thesis, which is that mediating faculty is, as we have already said, the judgment. So if we want to follow this track, we must take into account that this faculty is precisely the judgment that Kant have described in other places as the faculty of subsuming particular cases and rules. It is of determining whether something stands under a given rule or not, or as the faculty of thinking the particular as contained under the universal. This last definition of judgment from the second introduction of the critique of judgment is followed by a very well-known distinction between the two functions of judgment. I quote, if the universal, the rule, principle, or law is given, then the judgment which subsumes the particular under it is determining. If, however, only the particular is given and the universal has to be found for it, then the judgment is simply reflective. About this matter, there would be much to say, but I'll just point out that as Kant himself, as well as many others thought, these two functions are not simply coordinated, but subordinated. The reflective function, which constitutes the inner core of the power of judgment, takes priority over the determining insofar as any subsumption of a particular case under a rule implies that the rule that is right to the case was previously found. Therefore, any determining judgment implies a previous reflective judgment, and even if that previous judgment is not explicit. And there's no way of thinking that reflective activity as some kind of mechanical calculus. That's precisely the fourth thesis. Judgment can't be reduced to logical calculus. Kant was somehow aware that we could be tempted to seek in the general logic a tool which we can employ to control and predict the results of judgment, or to fill the gap between rules and cases with logical rules. Therefore, he prevented us in the first critique from looking for such a controls in the rules of logic. That's relevant because we could try to hold something like this. We could say that it's right that there is some kind of gap between the rules and particular cases, and that we have to find out how to subsume this particular case under any rule. But maybe instead of employing judgment to discover how to apply this or that rule to that case, we can employ the rules of logical calculus to discover how to apply this or that rule. But that's impossible, holds Kant, because logic only offers new rules. Logic offers new rules that we still have to find out how to apply. And that way we can keep finding new rules to discover how to apply new rules and so on. That way of thinking would imply a total ignorance about what relies under the application sapori that doesn't emerge from some kind of lack of clearness of the rules, but from the empty space that separates rules and particular cases. But we could ask, if the power of judgment can't be explained in logical terms, does that mean that it's some kind of irrational faculty? If that acceptance of the application sapori implied the acceptance of a skeptical thesis about the correctness of the judgment, that will have a huge impact on the topic of the jurisdictional decision. But on the contrary, I think that Kant's solutions only involves some kind of questioning of the traditional identification between the boundaries of rationality and the boundaries of the normative space. Or in other words, I think that Kant holds that the exercise of the faculty of judgment can be non-arbitrary and therefore non-irrational, even if there is no normative instance that we can use as a definite guide of that exercise. And that means that Kant must admit the existence of some other kind of non-normative criterion that allows us to distinguish between a correct and an incorrect judgment. Kant develops his position on this topic in 3 different places. In the first critique and in theory and practice, he asserts that each particular act of judgment depends on the natural capacities of the person that elaborates that judgment, and adds that those natural capacities can't be by any means developed. This thesis arises from a very strong opposition between understanding as the faculty of rules and judgment as the faculty of subsuming particular cases under those rules. It seems to Kant that while understanding can be trained by providing new rules, judgment can't be, because there is no way of giving it rules, as we have already said. In other places, such as in anthropology or in the metaphysics of morals, Kant limits that first thesis by offering a more dynamic conception of the judgment, in the sense that it doesn't appear like a capacity that is definitely settled from birth, but as a capacity that can be developed and that we can actually only find absolutely formed in the elderly. Despite the difference with the first thesis, Kant holds here actually the same thesis. Judgment cannot be trained by the teaching of rules. The only difference relies on the fact that here he seems to be taking into account other kind of possibility for the development of the judgment, which is training with a lot of different cases, which can only happen when one has had a lot of experience during these years. But in both cases, Kant just seems to be displacing the problem of correctness of the different acts of judgment to the level of attitude of whoever executes those acts. But we can still ask one thing. Attending to which criterion can we distinguish between a correct judgment from an incorrect one? According to which criterion we can distinguish if the person who judges has or not a well-developed judgment? I must remember that this question has a significant importance from the point of view of the judge and the law that we are trying to discuss. I consider that we should look for the actual Kantian answer to that problem in the critique of judgment. But I can't yet offer a complete and systematic view of how Kant develops his position there, which I hope that will be part of my doctoral thesis. But for now, I can only point out what many others have already pointed, namely that the paragraph 40 of the last critique related to the topic of the sensus communis is the nuclear core of Kant's conception of judgment. I hold then that Kant's sensus communis can be thought as the criterion that we were looking for in order to distinguish between correct and incorrect judgment. That way, we could say that the idea of a sensus communis implies that a judgment can only reach correctness if it overcomes the merely subjective conditions that necessarily affect everyone that tries to connect particular situations and general rules. And that way, Kant's reflection on judgment must stay necessarily open to the rational dialogue as the main tool that we, finite and only partially rational beings, can actually overcome our subjective limitations. All this has a huge impact on the topic of the role of the judges in Kant's understanding of law, because I think that this must lead us to think that we cannot assume that as other thinkers of the 18th century, as Montesquieu thought, the act of judging is somehow neutral and irrelevant. On the contrary, according to Kant, the act of judging can be reduced to any kind of neutral and logical calculus. But nonetheless, Kant tries to escape the possible irrational consequences of this thesis. And that is basically what I consider that he's trying to do when he tries to establish some kind of universalism that isn't based on principles, in which the notion of sensus communis plays a nuclear role. Anyway, I can only end by thanking once again the CECLI for inviting me to this event, and by repeating that this is a work in progress that I hope that I can present in a more developed form in a couple of years. Thank you all, and I present you here the reference in case anyone is interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos, for your presentation. It's really interesting. And now we have time for observations, comments, questions. So I'm not, okay. I see you all now. So I don't know if any of you have questions or comments. Yes, Karin. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I can start. I thought it was very interesting, and I thought it was nice how the second and the third paper in a way follow on one another in terms of how you go from the categorical imperative all the way down to the application of certain principles in practice. But I guess there will be questions on this, but I would like to ask a question to Gustavo on his paper on modality, which I think is a very different topic, evidently. And well, so I thought it was interesting, but I think I wasn't quite sure how you relate the various parts of your paper. And maybe more specifically, with regard to Kant's distinction between the discursive understanding on the one hand and an infinite non-discursive understanding on the other hand, to me, it was not quite clear what this really adds to our understanding of the role of modality. Because I think that in a way we can draw a distinction in a number of ways, and attribute to God what we don't attribute to the human understanding. But does this really, provide us with arguments to specify what is specific to the human understanding and the way in which we judge about things in terms of their possibility, their actuality, and their necessity? Yeah, so just asserting that this is something that God doesn't do, but that we humans need to do, yes, drawing these model distinctions. So how relevant is this?
Thank you, thank you, Karin, for the question. Yes, for start, the paper is quite longer. I have to short it up. So some parts have gone, but I take the paragraph 76 from the third critique as a starting point for the rest of the paper. There we have these differences that this intuitive understanding wouldn't have to thought precisely, wouldn't have to conceive or comprehend the totality as possible or actual or necessary. That brings me to back to the first critique and the logic to see how this discursive understanding is what necessarily have to think his concepts as possible, as unities of possibility. And that brings me to the process in which discursive understanding produces concepts. That's why I go to the determinative actions. How the determinative action is a synthesis of the abstracted data. And I think it is important to see the differences between the critical point of view of modality and what we may refer to more rational thinking or more, see, the topic of modality in Leibniz, for example, where possibility is a mark with ontological ground. So God, for example, thinks connections of possibility. In Kant's point of view, God wouldn't conceive things as possible. That's a mark of human understanding and not an ontological mark of things. So I think it's interesting at least to see how this implication of the critical term, even in modal judgments, that possibility and even actuality and necessity doesn't refer to things in itself, we can say, but to our way of thinking things. And this open the spectrum to be able to think the possibility of things that are not necessarily linked to intuition. And that also brings us the problem of the ideals, how ideas can think the possibility, for example, the transcendental ideal, the ens realissimum, that yes, it thinks the absolute possibility, the possibility. But when we take the possibility from things and we put it back in the human understanding, we are not able to deduce the existence of the absolutely necessary being only because we thought it as absolutely possible. I don't know if I'm clear in my answer.
Yes, but while listening to you, I thought of another way of phrasing my question, if I may, quickly. So, do you think that Kant could have developed his theory of modality based on the first critique only? Because we've got the metaphysical deduction, we've got everything about synthesis and so on, and about particular human activities. So that was my point. So why did you
Yes.
start from the third critique? Yeah.
There is there is some originality in the third critique. There, I have to study. That's my part of my doctoral thesis. What the third critique adds to the problem is the actual experience of things in nature that react or that can be thought as rationally organized. That's the problem. That is not in the first critique. So what happened when we, to understand a thing, an organized being, we need to think it as teleologically organized. Kant, in the third critique, resolved that antinomy, showing that contingency is part of human understanding and not of materiality. But it is a problem why we think organized beings as teleologically organized, or as a product of a technique. This is a question that I'm working for another paper. So what happened with the analogy between reason and organized beings? If we have to think something that Kant actually does in the first critique, think reason in analogy to organized beings, that appears throughout the first critique, but in the third critique, it appears that the order is reversed. We think organized beings in analogy to reason, but that's an hypothesis that I have to continue searching.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Timothy, I'm sure you have a question on the principle of determinability.
Oh, uh, um, yeah. Well, actually, I hadn't been phrasing the exact question you had just asked. But I can ask it in a different way, actually, for Gustavo, because I was interested in who he's arguing against. I think towards the beginning of the talk, you mentioned some Kantian approaches that you disagreed with. So I was going to ask you who you're arguing against, anyone there specifically, and why, and then also not just the Wolffian view or the ontological view, but contemporary views of morality based. I was going to ask you who in both realms you're arguing against and why. That would be interesting to me.
Thank you. I chose in the presentation to leave the commentators not named, to say, but these two standpoints yes, views on modality, one of pure syllogistical, or we can say pure syllogistical, and the other psychological. The modality as a psychological way of thinking, not a logical or ontological feature. I refer in my paper on psychological view, the Kent Smith in his work on the first critique, he talks about how modal judgments are an express of the psychological stand of the subject, and modal judgment would express that. And in the other view on modal judgments, that is the syllogistical, I take some articles from Beatriz Longenese, where she completely valid make her analysis from paragraph 11 from the first critique, where Kant think modality in relation to the syllogism. In my paper, I talk this longer, but that will be my two references for that use.
Thank you. Thanks. It's an interesting area, but I'd love to talk to you more about it and afterwards.
Yes.
Thank you, Timothy and Gustavo and Luis. That's
Yes.
a question.
Yes. So yeah, thank you so much for the fascinating talks. I really enjoyed the three of them. And I have a question to Marilu. So it's not really my field, but I want to learn a little bit more about your perspective on this. At a certain point, you said that so you don't think that right, the doctrine of right is subordinated to morality or to the categorical imperative, but at a certain point you said that there is nevertheless a necessary relationship between them. And I wanted you to explain a little bit more, what do you mean by this necessary relationship? Does it mean that a legislator should take into account morality when writing a law? Does it mean that an agent should take into account morality when thinking about a law or following a law? So what is this necessary relationship for you? What does it mean?
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. Well, I was, when I was doing my PhD thesis, I was trying to give an answer to these two more or less schools that say that there is no relation and there is a dependence between law and ethics and Kant, and the other that said that there's like a disconnection and whatever, no? And I'm saying my thinking on this is that there is a necessary connection in terms that the foundation, the ground of right, you need to find it in a moral theory. You need to find the concept of obligation. In that sense, and we have a few passages in all the metaphysics of morals that says that the categorical imperative is the source of normativity. No? That I will say that in some way you will need to find the source of normativity in practical reasons. In practical reason will be my ultimate answer of that, you know. And in that way is necessary, but it is not necessary. It is not direct, or I will say it's indirect in the way that you cannot find in Kant philosophy of right like a pure derivation from what is right if you only use a categorical imperative. I mean, for example, women's rights, that we have a lot of problems with Kant about that. You know? If you try to use a categorical imperative, or if you try to use another kind of argument or principle of moral theory, I mean, you will find that in Metaphysics of Morals, Kant has the opinion that of why women should not have this right of vote. So what I try to say is that it's indirectly in the way that implies, first of all, the principle of right that derivates from categorical imperative. There is like a line there, like a direct argumentation there. But you need also empirical and empirical elements. And in that sense, it's indirect. It's not only that it's right for Kant is not only to say that it's just. You also have to pursue to the laws and the legislature and to have that process, like that legal process. So in that way, I think it's indirect. And the other thing that in some way is indirect is connected with the exposition of my colleague Marcos, and with the key idea of reflexive judgment, because in some way Kant is a reformist. He believes in reforms. He's against revolution in some way. He thinks we should obey law, we should obey right. Nevertheless, we have the duty, we have also the right to, with our critical reason, our judgment, try to improve law. So it's indirect that because you need this process to make better the laws, and the concept that this is not my own concept, is from my doctor, the director of my thesis director from Haven Universität, is that the idea of Rex synthesis, that when you start to study Kant with the categorical imperative, you said, okay, if I have this, I have everything to know what is just and right and everything. But in some way, doctrine of right in Kant implies empirical elements and also rational elements. So in some way, what is right, I will say, is a synthesis that implies a empirical and rational elements. So more or less, I will say that. I don't know if I have been clear with my explanation, but more or less, I will say that.
Can I just have a quick follow-up? Yeah. Okay. No, it's very clear. So I was asking the question about these two levels: the level of the agent, the level of the legislator, and you said no, it's the third level at the level of the philosopher, thinking about the legislation that we have, perhaps this necessary connection, right? The connection is not for the legislator, but for the philosopher who is thinking about how.
No, I'm sorry. No, you're right. What I want to say, I forgot. Sorry for that. Is that for legislator they have this moral duty without coercion, but legislators, the people who create laws, have the moral duty to try to make better laws, to try to make a better place in the context of, but they don't have any coercion duty as us, as the people.
Okay.
You know, they only have moral duty. I will say that.
And does the moral law play any role in the legislation, in the concrete legislation? Can we use the moral law to evaluate whether a law is just or unjust or not? It doesn't play any role at all.
No. Of course, it implies a role in terms of the reflected judgment that my colleague already exposed.
Okay.
You know, and also as a regulative idea.
Okay.
And also in terms of the progress of the conquer of our rights.
Yeah.
I will say that. Thank you
effectively.
for your question, really.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. Yeah.
Well, any other comments or question? Timothy.
Sure, just maybe a question for Marcus. No, I think you ended with talking about Kant's capacity of judgment as perhaps something that forgive me if I'm wrong, but something that cannot be trained or developed. And then it seems like he sort of changed his mind maybe on this. No, you can develop it throughout your life, or you can develop in some way in connection with common sense. Would you be able to say more about that, or maybe indicate something more definite about your picture of Kant's capacity of judgment, what it is, and ask this maybe because this relates to the issue of modality with Gustavo and our ability to say what is probable, what is true, what is necessary. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a core point of my argument, because for Kant, the idea of a stable and rigid ability, considering thought judgment that way, reinforces the point of the application sapori somehow this way. And let's say that kind of argument serves Kant to show that under any kind of application of norms or rules, relies always some kind of faculty that is not related to knowing more rules. And it's quite interesting to think about that in the field of law, because in law, we have actually a lot of rules that are subordinated in a way that the subordinated rules tries to explain in a more particular way how a more general rule should be applied. But the point of Kant, and I think that's the point of Wieland, and that's the general point of recognizing that there is some kind of faculty as the judgment and not only understanding, relies on the idea that it doesn't mind how particularly explained a rule is, that one always have to add something more than knowledge of rules to apply rules. And I don't know if that answers your question or I haven't understood it correctly.
Well, you've understood it. I mean, but it's interesting because I would like to think I could get better at the application of rules, for example, certainly. And you're saying that does not depend upon, or it does, or there's some dependence between familiarity with variety of rules, ways they're applied. Well, yeah, I don't know.
The interesting point about this is that the final point of this is that we can actually find or elaborate any kind of rule that per se is capable of applying on other rules. Every application of rules requires a human capacity that Kant called judgment, Aristoteles phronesis, and whatever we want to call it. There is no possible mechanism of application of rules, and that's the role of the judges in the juridical system.
Okay, thank you, Marcos. And Laura has a question. Hello, Laura. How are you doing?
Hello, Liana, how are you? I have a question in relation to the first talk. I think you have said something about it, but I would like to know if you could further develop it. That is the relationship between your reading of modal concepts in the third critique and the definition that Kant provides in the first one of necessity, reality, and possibility in the principle of modality. If you think it's like an extra argument, how do you think it gets along with the definition within the system of principles, for example?
Thank you, Laura. My answer will go again to the originality of third critique, which is the contemplation on material things. That's something that, from the principles alone, we cannot foresee. So we can think about the possible experience from principle and how to correctly subsume something as possible or actual or necessary. But in the third critique, we have a reflective judgment that with all that principles as background, we can say, presents a problem because organized beings are a product of the mechanism of nature, but we need to think about them as teleologically organized. That's a type of causality that goes against the rule of time in causality. So how we can resolve that problem that is foreshadowed in the first critique, but it has its originality. It's foreshadowed, I mean, because the antinomy in the third critique is about mechanism and teleological judgments. In the first critique, we have antinomy, the third antinomy, for example, that has that same problem in a way, but not thought in an actual objects of experience. I'm not if I answered the question.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, Karen. We're not listening.
Sorry about that. So I was saying, if there's someone who has a question and hasn't yet asked it, then of course I'd like to give that person priority. Yeah, but in any case, since we have time, I'd like to ask a question to Marilou. So I thought it was very interesting, yes, and for me as well, it's true, it's not really my area, but so on the whole, I thought it was really convincing, but then I wasn't completely sure about one specific element of your proposed solution, namely the fact that Kant somehow introduces the role of empirical elements. And so I was thinking that maybe the question that Kant addresses is the question as to the role that the categorical imperative can play under the condition of its application to a community of free individuals. And so my question is, well, isn't he interested in the conditions of the applicability of the categorical imperative to this particular realm, which is not the realm of the individuals, but the realm of a community of free beings? And that in this particular application of the categorical imperative, or no, let me put it differently, that the categorical imperative can only be meaningfully applied to this particular realm of a community of free beings under the condition of another principle, yeah, which you call the what is it, the universal principle of right, yes, or Kant calls it universal principle of right. So that the second principle that is brought into play somehow makes possible the application of the categorical imperative to the realm of a community of free beings in the first place. And so for me, in the context of the critique of pure reason, the schematism is very important. And the schematism is also about the question as to how we can apply a pure principle to a particular manifold. Yeah, so you need some kind of mediation, which in the case of the schematism, he calls the schema. But the schema itself is a priori. Yeah, it makes it possible to apply the category of causality to an empirical manifold, but the schema itself remains a priori. And so I was wondering if the universal principle of right plays a similar role. Yes, that it is an a priori principle that somehow accounts for the applicability of the categorical imperative to a particular manifold, namely a community of free beings. And so that would account for the indirectness, but it would not involve at that level the introduction of empirical elements. Does that make sense?
I will try to answer. I'm not sure if I understand the last part of the question, but
Okay.
just let me know if I didn't understand. I will say, I mean, I agree with your interpretation in the sense that the categorical imperative is the basis of the universal principle of right to generate the condition of freedom in the community. In that way, there is a direct line, in this justification, and that's why the categorical imperative is the ground of why we should obey right, and also is the ground about why obey right and why right is freedom, why right implies this principle of universal right, but also why we should respect other freedoms and of course also our own freedom. So I will say that I agree with that, but as I try to explain in my paper, that's why it's indirect. It is not directly from the categorical imperative. You need another principle that is universal principle of right. Sorry for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't followed the discussion of the schematism in the context of philosophy of right. What I have to say in some way is that I will say that we have to include the idea of reflective judgment to understand the synthesis between empirical and rational elements in Kantian philosophy of right. Kant in Doctrine of Right said that we need both elements. I don't have the quote at this moment, but he said it in Doctrine of Right. So I will say we need the idea of reflective judgment, and also we need the idea, and try to reflect in this idea, and that from the concept of freedom, we can also find the concept of right. I mean, like like a priori or from an analytical point of view. So I will say that in some way Kant includes empirical elements because he knows his times. He was he knows that they only apply for justice or to. He even said that a philosopher has a function in context of what is just, but you need judges also. It is not enough to say that something is unfair to change the law. It is necessary, but it is not enough. You need all the juridical process to create law in this sense, to create new rights.
Yes.
I don't know if I answer.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, thank you very much. But I think that my question has similarity to Luis earlier on, namely, who is the we? Yes, who needs the empirical elements? Is it the actual judge who needs to take into account certain circumstances, or is it the actual lawmaker who also needs to take into account certain a number of circumstances, or is it the philosopher? And I think in that regard, I would hesitate just to say, look, it's the philosopher who needs to take into account these empirical elements. I think that the task of the philosopher is to, as it were, deduce the principles of law as far as possible, as far as it is possible to do so a priori, but to keep in mind the fact that these principles apply to a community of free beings. And so maybe I would distinguish a bit more strictly between the task of the philosopher on one hand and the task of the lawgiver and the actual judge on the other hand. And I guess, Luis, that this was also your worry.
Yeah, I agree. You need to make a distinction between the task of the lawgiver that had this moral duty, only moral duty to act according to the imperative, categorical imperative, and in the specific, the principle of universal right. You also have the task of the philosopher, that it will be like from the point of view of critical use, from the point of view of critical use of reason, and people that also needs in some way a categorical imperative to find like a reason of why to follow law. So I think you can make like these three distinctions.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much.
Any other question?
I could ask maybe just a follow-up on that about, I was just curious about the distinction between and the role of categorical and hypothetical judgments. Mary Lou, and because I believe you're saying that Kant's not a contract theorist, and so he can't take maybe this easy way of distinguishing between morality and rights, and one being a categorical and one being sort of a hypothetical imperative. But is there then do I have that right? And is there then a role for hypothetical imperatives, in right? And I only ask that because I recall the oath of citizenship that we have in the United States here. It's like, if you become a citizen, then you have to say, well, I will in fact take upon these duties if necessary. As a citizen, I will take up arms for my country. I will, etc. I will forswear allegiance, and maybe that's a hypothetical imperative or something like this. But
thank you very much for your question, Timothy. I will try to answer. Well, I will say from the point of view of the source of normativity in philosophy of right, the source of normativity is there is no option for a hypothetical imperative. And the reasons are because from Kant's point of view, you cannot justify obey law according to happiness, according to anthropology. You have to found the normativity of right accordance to practical reason. And he said in Metaphysics of Moral pure practical reason. And this emphasis in pure, it is really important because otherwise you can add a hypothetical imperative. So in this sense, he's not a contractualist. And the exit of a state of nature, principio ecce undum, is not because you are not doing this because you will have more benefits. It's like a duty, so you have to obey because it's like from a point of view of a categorical imperative. You know, what I will say, but this is a little bit controversial, but I will say because this is the place I should say this. You know, I will say that in context of property law, in some way, Kant said that you need to exit a state of nature in some way to assegurate like possession, assegurate property. I don't know if I've been clear with this. I don't know if I could do a good translation, but and in that sense, you can make like a hypothetical imperative, because in some way, state should guarantees your property. And in that, from the point of view of that argument, you can say in some way that is in some way hypothetical, from a hypothetical imperative. But in the other hand, the source of normativity in philosophy of right, Kant will say it is from pure reason. So in that sense, cannot be hypothetical.
Yes, we have another question. Farhad.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. I was thinking at the heart of all the problems we're discussing here lies the connection between Kant's critical works and his doctrinal works, yeah? So I was thinking the categorical imperative comes from a critical work, and it might be deemed as the conditional possibility of whatever doctrine he establishes after. And yeah, when you were trying to establish a necessary connection, as you were calling it, I was thinking, yeah, I can have like Kant's second critique, and I can maybe I was thinking, if you want to write a metaphysics of moral in 21st century, that metaphysics of moral would be totally different than what Kant wrote in his time. But you can still write something in conformity with the second critique. Yeah, in that sense, you are still to judge, according to some moral principles that the philosopher has provided there. And it doesn't necessarily give you those specific particular rights that, Kant discusses in his work. So what is your take on that? And it follows up on what Corinne was referring to, because in the second critique, Kant explicitly says that the moral law has no schema. And this is the enigmatic part. So we have a moral law which does not have any schema. That means that in no way we can derive any, I don't know if it's the right term to use here, but any right, so to speak, out of the categorical imperative, because categorical imperative remains neutral to whatever specific forms, the judge wants to establish a law, so to speak. Yeah, how do you bridge the gap between this critical categorical imperative and the doctrine of morals, in a sense that Kant himself will say there is no connection, and the only thing you can do is just judge whether what you have is in conformity with the moral law?
It's really a good question and really difficult, but I will try to answer. First of all, you have like in some way your question is like one of the big discussion about how we should interpret philosophy of right of Kant, because there is like one group of commentators that said that we should just derivate from moral theory, from the second critique, you know, all the rights, you know, like a really simple deduction or really simple derivation of what Kant says in second critique. But I'm not sure about that, because if you read Metaphysics of Morals, you will find you will find that Kant is not only talking about ethics, he also is talking about what is just and what is right in some way. So the thing is that he also have this a particular view of in Tugendlehre, in Doctrine of Virtue, and he also used another principle. I mean, what I try to say is that the indirect connection is you also have it in some way in the second part of Metaphysics of Morals. Kant also applied to another principle in Doctrine of Virtue. He said like supreme principle of virtue, as also he also do that in right, in philosophy of right, in Rechtslehre. So that's why I think you have, from my point of view of my interpretation, you have to understand that if we are, when Kant is studying another topic in some way, he will use second critique, but also in his way of studying this new object, he will add a new principles to understand more things, to explain more things. So in some way, yes, there is a connection with second critique, but of course, also Kant allows himself to introduce a new concept, new principles. And that's in some way a huge discussion in the interpretation of philosophy of right, because there is like a group of people will say that there is like a really, really strong necessary connection between second critique and philosophy of right, and the ones that say that Kant is saying something different, really, really different, and really, really, really new. There is no connection. So with my paper, I try to say that in some way there is a connection necessary, but not a direct connection. Indirect connection.
Thank you, Dobbs.
Okay, thank you. Thank you and congratulations for the three speakers. We are very proud of the papers, the articles you have submitted. And thank you for all of you for being here. Luis, Felipe, it was very nice to meet you. And well, I think that we are going to see each other in the following sessions. So thank you very much. I don't know, Luis, if you want to add, or Karin, yes.
Yes,
sure.
So thanks, Ileana. And yes, also again, congratulations on all the speakers for their very interesting work and their presentations. I just wanted to mention again that we'll keep open the Zoom meeting for those who have questions. And I also wanted to mention that we'll meet again in 2 weeks. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. And the next session will be on August 19th and will be hosted by the Mexican branch of the North American Kant Society. And the session is titled Kant Studies in and from Mexico. So that's it for my part.